I was a skeptic who came to faith through asking hard questions.
I'm a longtime Christian whose faith was challenged by hard questions. Whatever your story is, we all ask questions.
But some questions are more difficult to answer than others, and some questions keep us up at night.
Who am I?
Does my life have value?
What determines my identity and purpose?
Is there a God?
Does he care?
What will happen when I die?
Is it even possible to know the truth?
We believe every question is valuable, and we receive every question as a gift.
So welcome to the podcast, where we invite you to ask away. Hello again, or welcome if this is your first time listening to Ask Away. We are so glad that you can join with us this week. I'm Vitale, and I'll be honest, getting into the studio to record right now is a welcome break for me from the 34 Valentine's cards that I'm helping my little boys write for every single other student in their preschool and first grade classes. You know, back in the good old days when I was a kid, we just picked one person to send a card to, whereas these days, apparently, we're supposed to love everybody. And so here we are, 34 cards with glow-in-the-dark lizards are currently being prepared with shaky handwriting in our house because, you know, when you're 5 and 6 and you're little boys, what says friendship and affection better than a squishy glow-in-the-dark lizard? So what with this being Valentine's week, Vince and I decided that we wanted to share with you an Ask Away episode that we actually put out a couple of years ago, but which has proved to be one of our most listened to episodes and most requested topics for us to speak on. Who should I date and why should I marry? I'm pretty sure that the popularity of this content says less about how insightful we are and much more about how everybody is struggling in this area of life. But whatever the case may be, we hope that you also find it helpful, or you have someone in your life you can feel free to share it with if you think it will be helpful for them. But before we get into it, I did first want to offer you just one specific encouragement for this particular Valentine's week. And one of the things that we go on to share about in this episode is that you're only really ready to be married to someone else if you're already in a marriage relationship with God. Interesting thought. We'll unpack it a bit more later. But, you know, what we mean by that is until you've learned what it really means to love God first and love him well, you're not really ready to be married to anybody else. And so as we go about preparing for Valentine's Day this year, you know, whether you're buying your loved one glow-in-the-dark lizards or you're thinking about other possibly more thoughtful ways that you can show your particular care and gratitude for the people in your life, I also want to challenge you to ask the question, what could I be doing this week to show God how much I love him? You know, in general, I think as Christians, we can have a lot of unwarranted existential angst over how God feels about us or what our experience of him is currently like. But I think we spend far less time than we probably should be considering how God may be experiencing us and whether we're loving him in a way that brings him joy. And part of the reason for this is because we rightly think of God as self-sufficient. And it's true, he doesn't need us. He isn't lonely without us. His love is and always has been complete in a way that means he lacks for nothing. And yet, just because he doesn't need us to love him, it doesn't mean that he doesn't long for us to love him. You know, a couple of years ago, I read my son's, the children's book, The Giving Tree, for the first time. And guys, I was not prepared. I wasn't ready for what that book would do to my heart. It absolutely destroyed me. And I sat there reading it and just weeping to my children who were kind of looking at me in deep confusion. They did not get it. But, you know, the whole premise of the story is that there's this apple tree that loves a little boy, and the little boy loves the apple tree, and they play together all the time. Gosh, I'm still tearing up thinking about it. But, you know, sitting in this, the little boy sits in the shade of the tree. He climbs the tree playing hide and seek in its branches. He enjoys the apples from the tree. But then the little boy grows up and he forgets to enjoy the tree. And instead, he just starts taking from it. First, he takes the apples to sell, then the branches to build a house, and then the trunk to build a boat and sail away. And every time the boy comes to visit, the tree is so excited to see him, but the boy just couldn't care less. He just wants what the tree could give him. Until at last, when the tree is nothing but an old stump, the boy finally comes back as an old man and sits down to rest on the stump of the tree. And finally, we're told that the tree is happy. Now, that book just about broke me when it dawned on me, this is how we are with God. You know, God didn't make us just to get something out of us. He made us to love us. But how easily we forget that. And we wind up spending our lives trying to figure out what we can get out of him. And, somewhere along the way, we become people who take from God rather than people who show up to enjoy him. Yes, he made us to receive his love and he gives it gladly. But do you know what the deepest longing of his heart really is? Is that we might love him back. The other day I was reading John 11 when Jesus is at the tomb of Lazarus with his weeping sister Mary, when I came across the words, Jesus deeply moved in spirit. And it was like this light bulb went off and I suddenly thought, oh my goodness, Jesus feels things deeply too. And on the one hand, it feels like such a dumb thing to say. Of course he feels things. And yet sometimes I can forget that he's actually affected by me. It's easier to think of God as stoic, as kind of far off and undisturbed by emotion, but that's not how the Bible depicts him at all. Just because God doesn't need us to love him, it doesn't mean that he doesn't want us to. Far from it. That is the deepest longing and desire of his heart. What parent wouldn't want their children to love them? It's why Jesus names this as the greatest commandment. He says the most important one is this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. And in fact, as image bearers of God, we're given this unique gift of free will, which means that in all creation, we are the only creatures who have the ability to choose whether to love God or not, which means that we're actually in this unique position of being able to give him a gift that nobody and nothing else in all creation can give to him, the gift of loving him, not because we had to, but because we choose to, because we want to, because he deserves it, because we love him. So what if this Valentine's week, instead of waking up and wondering, what have you got for me today, God? We instead started our days by saying, God, what opportunities do I have to show you that I love you today, to love you with everything, with my whole heart, soul, mind, strength, every part of myself, every moment of my day, whatever it takes to ensure that you have a really good experience of me, that you enjoy this day in my company. God, this Valentine's Day, I want to bless you. I want to move your heart. I want to put a smile on my Father's face. Before we think about any other relationship in our lives and how to work those out, isn't this where we should be starting out? And just think, how differently might this week go for every relationship in your life and the way that you love others if actually your first desire was to love God like that before anything else. So with that thought in mind, I invite you to jump into the rest of the episode, and I hope that you enjoy it.
I know everyone is wondering, Joe, what did you get me for Valentine's Day?
Well, we're going to be spending Valentine's Day with your parents this year, so I'm giving you some of your mom's home-cooked meatballs for a change. I think after 15 years of being married to me, you'll probably just be glad to get back to the original. So
No,
you're welcome.
No,
you're welcome.
they're both great. I have no opinion on whose meatballs are better.
You've learned something in the last 15 years.
Yeah, there you go.
Again.
There's marriage advice right there. We have been laughing at how gift giving has, changed over 14 years. Was it last Valentine's Day or your birthday when I gave you a hotel night by yourself?
It was my birthday.
Your birthday?
It was glorious.
So it was a night away.
Present ever.
And, early in our marriage, before we had kids, it would have been, a night away for the two of us. But in this season of life, it was Joe having a night away on her own with a full 12 hours of sleep.
It was truly marvelous.
So we're excited to dig into just the topic of marriage, dating, singleness. We've been thinking about this a lot more recently than perhaps the few years before that, because we're in a church, a home church, and there's quite a lot of college students in our church. And so we've been getting requests to meet up and talk about dating. And boy, dating has changed since we were in college as well.
Yeah,
and so
we were like pre-dating apps.
That's right. We were pre-dating apps. So we're trying to figure it all out. But it's actually been really good for us as a married couple as well, because sometimes we're talking to people who are either dating or thinking about dating. and we'll sort of make a point, and then we'll kind of catch each other's eyes and be like, oh yeah, like we should probably do that. We should probably take that advice. So it's been really good for us. And we hope this episode will be of use to you, whether you're in a dating stage of life or not, whether that is relevant to you or not. We've been reflecting on how sometimes we don't discern well in this area because we have a misconstrued view in the first place of what marriage is, and therefore of what the purpose of dating is, and therefore of who we should be looking for, or even when or whether we should be looking for someone at all. So, Joe, if someone's asking themselves, when should I get married? What are your initial thoughts?
Yeah, I think we got to take it a step back from that question, because I would drop the when. I think the real question first and foremost should be, well, should I marry? Is marriage something that I should be aiming for? And I think for all of us, really, we've been conditioned by, everything from the films that we watch growing up, the books we read, the expectations of family and community and parents, just to be trained to think that marriage and, particularly romantic and sexual intimacy are the goal and the purpose of life. And that if you don't have those things, then actually you'll never be complete, you'll never be fulfilled. But I just think from a Christian perspective, that is so far from reality. Not to say that those aren't good gifts, but, marriage is spoken about highly in the Bible, but it is not the ultimate thing. If nothing else, as Christians, we know that you can live a fully human life full of purpose and love and meaning and significance without being married, because the most fully human life ever lived, the life of greatest significance and love and purpose and meaning, was lived by Jesus Christ. And he was single. He's
right.
Somebody who never got married. Mm-hmm. So if we think our life is going to be incomplete or lacking, that somehow God has abandoned us or betrayed us if we never wind up getting married, then I think we actually have some really deep misconceptions about what life is all about. I remember in college when somebody had just broken up with me, and I was really devastated at the end.
It was not me. It was not me, for the record.
It wasn't Vince. But I was totally heartbroken, and I went to one of my close friends, and I think I was just looking for some comforting platitudes in the moment, like, don't worry, there are plenty more fish in the sea, or another bus always comes along, or something like that. She just looked me dead in the eye, and she said, Joe, God doesn't promise us a partner, he promises us himself.
Good friend,
but didn't feel like it in the moment. I'll be honest, I was kind of mad. I that wasn't what I wanted to hear. And I can remember that felt like bad news to me. And it was actually only much, much later on, maybe even a couple of years later, that I reflected back on that and thought, oh my goodness, God promises us himself.
Right.
God promises us himself. How is that bad news to me? Why does that feel like settling or like the less good option? Yeah, in one sense, I think when people long for marriage, they're understanding something about the purpose, which is that the goal of life is intimacy, that we are wired for intimacy, that we are made for intimacy, we're made for love, but we're made for love with God. God is the one who made us. He is the one who is love. We're told in the Bible, God is love. And so all of those longings that we have, that we think a human person is supposed to fulfill in us, actually, people are not supposed to be placeholders for that, but we're supposed to look higher and to God. In one sense, you might say, yeah, of course you should marry, but the person you should marry, according to the Bible, is God. There's this beautiful metaphor of marriage that runs all the way through Scripture, through the entirety of the Bible. But actually that metaphor of marriage that we're all called to, it's between God and his people, or between Christ and his bride, the church. And so that's what we're really aiming for. And it's epic, and it's huge, and it's intimate, and it's amazing. It's the one relationship where we can be fully known and fully loved. But I think if we displace that and try and look for that in a person as opposed to in God himself, then actually we're doing a disservice to other people, and we're putting an incredible burden on human relationships that they were actually never made to carry. We can't look at another person and expect them to solve all our problems or, fulfill all of our needs. Nobody can actually do that. You're great, Vince, but you can't do that.
Not even close.
I think it was St. Augustine who said, you've made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. And I just think that's true. And I think even in the best of human relationships or marriages, if you're looking to put on a person what can ultimately only be found in God, you'll still wind up feeling restless and dissatisfied. And you're going to feel like, why doesn't this relationship fulfill me the ways that I expected it to? And I think that's when relationships and marriages get into trouble, because we've put something on them they were never intended to carry, that actually is only God who can know us completely and love us in full anyway. And that's an amazing thing. But that means he's the goal. Like, God is the one we should marry.
Yeah, that's so good. And it just reminded me of hearing someone talk about, this idea that actually if I put you first, I'm actually going to love you, Joe, less than if I put God first.
Yeah.
And then allow my love with him to overflow into our relationship. And it's sort of counterintuitive, but I want to love you as much as I can. And that actually counterintuitively means not putting you first, because that's the way that God has designed things for our marriage to actually point towards that ultimate marriage. And the other thing that I think sometimes we don't realize, which I think is really interesting, is that there's a sense in which we're all called both to singleness and to marriage. If we just put together some of what we've already said, we're all called to singleness, at least for portions of our lives, at the beginning of it, for sure. For many of us at the end, if our spouse were to pass away before us, and for some people throughout the middle portion of life as well. And then as the church, as you've said, because we are all the bride of Christ, so we're also all, in a sense, called to be married. So it's this whole dichotomy of singleness or marriage is really not the right way to frame it. We're all called to both, and both are good, because both point in their own ways to the ultimate marriage that we are created for. Singleness reminds us that we are waiting in hope for our truest companion, God himself. And marriage, likewise, is a season that points beyond itself by foreshadowing and reflecting that ultimate union again with our truest companion. So both are intended not as ends in themselves, but to spur us on into deeper relationship with God. So a big question to start with, singleness is a gift. It's given to some. How do you know if it is right for you?
Yeah. And so I think we've got to frame it in terms of what the goal is, right? So if the aim is to get close to God, then actually in different ways, you've said it, singleness and marriage can both do this. Scripture calls them both gifts. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, the Apostle Paul says, I wish that all were as I myself am. He was single, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. So he's calling both singleness and marriage gifts there. I think we get a little bit confused here sometimes. I think people can start to think, well, maybe the gift of singleness means you have some kind of superpower where you're just so excited to be single, or vice versa with marriage, as if that just means you're wired for it and it's your heart's desire. And I think we have to be honest that actually sometimes that isn't the case, is it? Like, to some people who are single, it doesn't feel like a gift. Some people who are married, it doesn't feel like a gift. But I think we have to acknowledge when Paul's talking about it here, he's not talking about a special superpower for one or the other. He's actually just talking about the state that you're in. Whatever state that you're in, that is the gift that God has given you. It doesn't mean it's a permanent state.
At that time.
As you've already said. But that is the gift. And so in a way, the question of how do I know which one is right for me, it's a little bit complicated, because that question assumes you're the one who gets to decide. And that's not always true, is it?
Wow.
The idea of a gift is actually it's something given to you by God. And I think we can be honest that sometimes we can look at someone else's gift and wish it was our own. And there can be a struggle in that. And I also think we need to think about what do we mean by gifts? I was doing a study on the life of Mary, Jesus's mother, recently, and looking at all of the words used to describe her as someone who's highly favored by God and who's blessed by God. You read the opening chapters of Luke's gospel and you think this woman is going to have the easiest, best life ever. But then as you read on and you realize how hard her life becomes, particularly being the one to stand there at the cross, watching her son be killed. And you suddenly realize, wow, for someone to be blessed and favored by God doesn't mean their life will be easy.
Yes.
And that helps me when I think about this here as well, that sometimes God gives us gifts, that they are good gifts, but it doesn't mean that they're going to make life easy. And that's true of both singleness and marriage. There are times when singleness can be extremely painful and it can feel very lonely. There are times when marriage can be extremely challenging and you think, my goodness, maybe it would be easier if I was single. A gift from God doesn't mean it's always going to feel easy. Both in their own ways have challenges, both in their own ways have tremendous blessings.
Yes.
But I think the reason they're a gift is because whichever state you're in, whichever one God has given you, there's an opportunity within it to draw closer to him. So I think the real question is just whichever one I have, it's okay to desire one or the other. I know people who feel strongly either way about which one they would like. Paul says himself, if you desire to be married, go for it. But also recognizing sometimes, for all sorts of reasons, it might not be possible that we wind up with the gift that we want. But whichever one we have, there is an opportunity within it to continue to draw close to God and to look to him. And so, if you're married, there's something about, a marriage relationship that humanly, is it symbolic of the covenant of marriage that we have between God and his people. And so there's a sense in which marriage on earth is the closest thing we have that can point to the kind of intimacy we're made for with God. It's a signpost, in a sense, a foreshadowing of something better to drive you closer to him. For singleness, there's a gift within that as well, to be able to say, actually, whatever human relationships we have are not ultimate, but we're made for more and we're waiting for more and we're waiting for the day when we get to heaven and it's described as like the feast of the bridegroom, that this wedding celebration. And there's a significant symbolism in that as well. And there's a gifting in singleness as well, isn't there? Because, as Paul puts it, your attention isn't divided in the same way you're less distracted.
Yes.
You are able to pursue God in a more straightforward way in some ways, in that sense. So there are blessings and challenges to both, I guess, would be my point. But whichever one you find yourself in, whichever one God has given you for however long it may be, make God the goal in that. Look to how can I, in this gift, receive it as a gift and give it back to him.
Yeah, and in that discernment, one thing I would say is whichever direction you're discerning in, to make sure you're motivated by what God is calling you to and not anything you're trying to run away from. In Matthew 19, the disciples say to Jesus, it sounds like it's better not to marry. And, Jesus says, not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. So it is given to some, the sense of it being a gift. And then later in the same paragraph, and there are those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And I just think it's significant that it's for something. It's for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. It's not motivated by fear or insecurity in either direction, whichever direction you discern, but has to be motivated by love. You don't want to choose singleness out of fear that no one will want to be with you or that someone will leave you. And you don't want to choose marriage out of fear that you won't be enough on your own or out of fear of loneliness. God does not call us out of fear, but into love for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, to love God and others in a particular sort of way. So whether you're pursuing singleness or marriage, pursue it because of what God is calling you to and not because of anything that you're trying to get away from.
Yeah, that's really good. But I guess the question is, if you are in a sort of prayerful posture and you're open-handed before God as to which gift he's going to give you, how do you know, say you're sensing, actually, like Paul said, I do eagerly desire to be married. How do you know when you're ready for that or when you should be actively pursuing it versus kind of being in a place of waiting and saying, hey, I'm not ready for that yet? How do you know?
The first thing I'd say, and probably the most central thing that I would say is definitely don't get married until you're already married. which requires, some quick clarification. But hopefully it's just memorable to think of it that way. I remember friends before we got married, Joe. I remember a couple friends who maybe, were not of a mindset where they were going to get married anytime soon, kind of asking, aren't you terrified of marriage? I don't think it was a particular comment on you, just sort of general comment on marriage, And I remember saying to a couple of people, no, I'm not, because I've already been married for years. So I know what I'm getting into. And they would sort of look at me with an odd look because, as far as they were aware, I had not been married before. But because I conceive of my relationship with God as a marriage, which is how the Bible conceives of it, I had already been living in a marriage in a very tangible sense, and in some ways with the most challenging spouse of all, God, right? Like no one challenges as hard and consistently as he does. No one demands faithfulness and honesty as intensely as he does. Like no one's a more jealous lover than he is. I think this is such a blessing of the Christian faith. You've kind of alluded to it already, but in other ancient Near Eastern myths, it might have been typical for gods to have other divine lovers, but this idea of God being the lover married to finite human persons, like that's radically new in the Old Testament. Hosea, Isaiah, Song of Songs. It's because, though, that I had been living in that marriage relationship with God that even before I married you, I knew something significant of what it was like for someone to be with me all the time and to know everything about me, even the most shameful things. I knew what it was like for my sin to directly affect another person. I knew what it was like to make decisions together with another person and to yield to them and to make sacrifices because they were in my life. And Joe and I specifically knew what it was like, because we were married to God, to be getting things wrong in a marriage and needing to receive grace. And hopefully that made us more ready to pass on that grace to each other as we stepped into marriage. And so, even on our wedding day, our vows were not foreign to us because Jesus had promised for better or for worse. Right? And we're so thankful that he did that. If he was only interested in what was better for him, he never would have endured the cross for us. And he promised for richer or for poorer. And that was not just a metaphor. Like, he literally gave up the riches of heaven in order to enter into union with us. And Jesus is God in the most concrete way, making that most radical wedding vow: all that I am, I give to you. The reason we could grasp the magnitude of the vows we were making to each other on our wedding day, I really think, was because they were exactly the vows that God had showed us how to make by making them to us. We had confidence in the marriage we were stepping into only because of the marriage we were already in. And that made a huge difference as we pursued marriage with one another. I really think that it did. And let me throw it back to you, Joe. Once we start to have a better understanding of what marriage is, what would you say to someone who asks, okay, whom should I marry?
Yeah, I think our starting point here is so often wrong. I think when it comes to this question of who to date, what's going on in the back of our minds is often the assumed question of, well, who's going to be best for me? We see this in the language that's around dating all the time, don't we? We talk about things like, oh, she's too good for him, or, he's way out of her league, or she could do better. He's a 7, she's a 10. I mean, what is she thinking? But the basic premise here seems to be, that there's a scale that some people are better than others. And so we always need to be shooting for the very best that we can hope to get according to, where we come in ourselves on the ranking. The question is, who is best for me? But if that's your framework, if the starting point is, well, who's the best fit for me? Who am I best with? Then it's actually really hard to commit to anyone, because I think you're always wondering, what if someone better comes along? What if this person is actually settling when there's my soulmate is just around the corner? And so, how can I ever narrow down my options in the world of dating, particularly in the culture we're in, where you can always swipe to the next person, right? You can always, well, let's just check out the next few people before we fix on this one.
Yes.
And that just makes it really challenging to get anywhere, doesn't it? Because I think in the back of our heads, we're now more aware than ever in this world of just so many opportunities in dating as in everything else. There's that feeling of, but if I say yes to one person, that means that I'm saying no to everybody else. And so I think we really get stuck here because it's being filtered through this sort of fear of missing out, I guess. There's a lot of FOMO. But I just wonder if actually we're really asking the wrong question. What if we went with a different starting point? Rather than who is best for me, what if we framed it again thinking about Jesus? And thought of the question, how did Jesus decide to marry? And what if Jesus had decided by asking that same questions? What if Jesus had asked the question, well, who's best for me?
Yeah, wow.
Who am I compatible with? Imagine if he'd asked that, thank God he didn't, right? Because if Jesus approached marriage that way, he would never have married me.
Wow.
This relationship would not exist. At the end of the day, it wasn't at all about what was best for Jesus. It was about his desire to serve others. So I think if we're asking that question, is he the best for me? Is she the best? We're asking the wrong question. A better question is, am I good for him? Is this person the one that God is calling me to serve and to love and to spur on? Are we both good for God together? Yes, we want a relationship to be healthy, but we want to ask, has God gifted me uniquely to serve this person? Who is God calling me to bless? And does the person that you're pursuing actually come alive because of your presence in their life? Do they become more like Christ? One of the ways that I actually realized that Vince was a good fit was because he seemed to be more for me than I even was for myself. The way he approached dating really shocked me because he just didn't seem to be about himself at all. But he was my greatest champion and cheerleader. He never tried to change me. He wasn't pushy, but he was so committed to me becoming everything that God had made me to be, to become the woman that God had crafted me to be. And he was absolutely committed to playing his part in assisting me into that, not by nagging or criticizing, but by encouraging and supporting and speaking truth and life into areas of my life where I'd got stuck in condemnation and lies, and just creating these spaces and opportunities for me to become who it seemed God was calling me to be. And it just made me think of Romans 8, verse 29. This verse talks about that the ones who God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his son. As Christian, we kind of understand that to be our purpose in life, to be conformed to the image of Christ. And what I loved when I met Vince was it seemed that he was so committed to that for me in my own life, to help me be conformed into the image of God's son. He was all about helping me become that. And the more I saw him do that, the more I thought, that's what I want to be for him. How can I do the same? He's loving me so graciously in this way. How can I respond the same way? So it kind of flipped everything. It wasn't about what could we get from each other, but it was so much more about what can we give? How can we serve? How do we help one another conform to Christ?
I think what you said before, Joe, about how did Jesus decide who to marry is just so critical, to think that if he asked some of the same questions that we ask, he never would have married us. Yeah, I just want to sit with that for a moment, because we need to make sure we're not taking an approach to dating that if God took, he never would have married us.
Right.
If we do that, then we're actually in opposition to the gospel. And, the wonderful thing about this gospel vision for marriage that Jesus lays out for us is that it means marriage is not about what we deserve, which has been such a blessing in our marriage. I remember we tell that story about were we just dating or engaged when you looked at me and said, Vince, I don't deserve you.
I think we were dating.
And maybe you were fishing for a couple compliments.
I was definitely fishing for a couple of
fishing for a couple of compliments, and it just came out of my mouth. I just said, no, you don't. Not the sort of recommended response, but I continued and I said, no, you don't, and I don't deserve you either. Isn't it wonderful? And I just think that's been such a blessing to us, because it means that we can rest. Like, we don't need to worry that someone better is going to walk around the corner one day. Because even if they did, I don't think it would register for us, because we just don't think about each other in comparative terms.
Right.
Neither of us deserve each other. How could one human being, sinful human being, deserve another human being in the image of God, as their very own? Like, surely that's beyond what any of us could deserve. But therefore, our marriage isn't some sort of ranking.
Yeah.
It's not a ranking system that we can lose. It's a gift, and therefore it's ours for good. And that means we can stop competing to be loved and just enjoy it. And I think sometimes we miss this. We know that our relationship with God is based on grace, and yet sometimes we still treat all the other relationships in our life as if they are some works-based competition. But the gospel is not just that relationship with God is based on grace, but it's an invitation for all of our relationships to be founded on grace. As we receive grace from God, we in turn extend it to others. We treat others with the grace that we've received.
Right. And the awesome thing about having a foundation of grace is that it allows for something really important, which is that marriage is founded on things that can be unchanging. Because you can run into big problems when we make timeless vows to each other, but we make them based on things that will inevitably change over time. Like, if you marry someone for their looks, you're in trouble, right? None of us are going to look the same in 30 years. It's been 15 this year. We don't look the same.
Yeah, forget 30.
Yeah, it's downhill from here. But, we don't. No one stays the same, do we? Life experiences form us. So much changes us. It's not just looks, but, what you do for work, the communities and friendships that you're a part of. Having kids changes everything about the dynamic of your relationship. The crises and the hardships that you go through, financial challenges, changes, and in situations, so much in your life is going to change. You will not remain the same people that you were on the day that you said your vows to each other. But if you're getting married because God has called you to serve someone, and he says that call is for a lifetime and that he's going to provide everything necessary for you to live it out for a lifetime, he'll keep giving you that grace, pouring it out into your life, then that can remain unchanging, even if people do change, because it's not based on circumstance. It's not based on, how does Vince change or not change over the years, or how do I change or not change? It's based on God, whose promises and vows are unchanging, and his grace that he keeps on extending to us every single day.
Yeah, and that's why I've been really challenged by, a few of our international friends who have had, arranged marriages in a sense. Need to be careful here, but they very much had like willful, decision over who they married, but it was still very different than the way we tend to do it.
Yes.
In America, or in the West, maybe more generally, families identifying, people who might be a good fit for one another in some sense, involving the community and the family much more in the discernment process, but possibly only meeting a few times with the person that they were going to marry, and then, making a willful decision to move forward into that marriage. And we have oftentimes found some of those marriages to be strong and healthy. And I think part of the reason is what you're saying, Joe, that in the best case scenario, in that sort of situation, part of what that can speak is actually we're concerned about the things that are unchanging, and those things are from God.
Right.
Like we don't need to kind of like date the field and check everyone out to see if there's somebody that's a little bit better looking or somebody that's a little bit more compatible with me. Actually, I know this person has a serious faith. I know that God is making these vows with us. I know that if we make that decision to step into that union, it's not about the ever-changing circumstances of life. It's about God's unchanging character and what he promises he will provide. And if you are really surrendered to that and really relying on that, I really do believe that God will give what you need for every challenge of marriage. And it's just been interesting to see some of those friends look at us and go, you guys are the ones who do it really weird, right? Like, so you just find somebody on an app and just like have a date with them, and you don't know their community, you don't know their family, they don't know your community, you don't know your family. You do the vast majority of your discernment about whether you guys are right for each other just kind of on your own independently, and then it doesn't work out. You just kind of like move on, and now you got all these emotional scars, and now you've dated like a dozen people before you find someone, and you're carrying all of those scars into your marriage. It was really challenging to think, whoa. Like they do things, some of our friends, very differently. But if it's founded on what God brings to the table and not us trying to figure it out and manifest it ourselves, there can be something really healthy in that.
Yeah.
All right. So if we get to the point now where someone's thinking they do want to date, there's a sense that maybe God has marriage in front of them, when would you say is the right time for someone to start dating?
Yeah, so I guess it's about, needing to know where you're headed and why you're heading there, and before you can plot out a good route, right? Like you've got to know what's the destination. And so when you know what marriage is about, when you know what the end goal of dating is, then you're able to make a good decision about how and when to date. And particularly when, it's been said, but when we understand marriage isn't about filling some void in our lives, that's God's job. But it's also not about getting a life upgrade. It's actually that sacrificial call to serve another person. Like that is the framework. I think then when you're in the context of a friendship and you begin to feel a particular longing to serve another person, and you've built up enough evidence that your presence and service in their life helps them to be more of who God has created them to be, those are all good signs that this could be heading in a good direction. And then if you begin to feel a desire in particular to count the cost of pursuing relationship with that person. We had a friend say the other day that a value is only a value if it costs you something. So that was a really profound line, actually. We think about dating as just receiving, but actually it's supposed to come with a cost. I mean, think about the cost it came with for Jesus, to say yes to us. And recognizing there is that sense in which, part of the cost is you are saying no to everybody else, but also you're saying no to the ease of a life that comes without that person. There are certain ways you can be, more self-centered when you're just on your own. There are sacrifices that may come with choosing to be married. It's part of the reason I think, some of the statistics we're seeing about why people aren't getting married as much today. When you're hearing what some of the decisions younger people are making and in terms of not choosing marriage, it's partly because they're recognizing actually the truth of the cost of it, of actually that, it does impact your career, that it does impact your location, that you may even wind up living in another country. You may even wind up living in America if you're willing to count the cost. And so I think there's just this recognition, rightly so, that there is a cost to choosing marriage. But rather than running from that, which is what a lot of people are doing today, they're saying, oh, this is too costly.
Right.
I don't want to do marriage. I'm going to aim for, you hear the phrase now, don't you, situationships. Like, let's just do something temporary with the understanding it comes with a sell-by date, that, there is going to be an end date to this relationship. But it's just, it's a temporary pleasure for the two of us, but we're not going to make those long-term choices because actually they seem too costly.
Right.
Actually, I think they're sensing something right, that marriage is supposed to cost you a great deal. That true love is sacrificial. The best love, is sacrificial. That's what we see in Jesus Christ, isn't it? It is actually going to cost you everything to truly lay down your life to love somebody else. But I think that's actually, a call to be excited about rather than something that's a reason to run the other direction.
Yeah, and this is one reason why I see a real challenge in, let me put it this way, at least the way that a lot of people use dating apps. And I'm not trying to say, that's evil and that can't work well. I've got really good friends in really healthy marriages who met in a way that seems healthy, online. So I'm not making some sort of sweeping statement like that. But if part of what you're looking for is, do I sense this calling, this leading from the Lord to sacrificially serve the other person? I think one of the challenges, at least, is that, if you just see someone online and you read a couple of things about them, and then all of a sudden you're sat across from them at a dinner table on a date. And before you basically have any evidence about whether God might be drawing you in that way towards a sacrificial service of this person, all of a sudden you're already there. You're already at the dinner table. The emotions and the attachments are already being elevated in really intense ways. Whereas if that same person, was worshiping in your church community, like, you might have observed them for months, praying, worshiping, serving others, just having good conversation in the context of the community. And then by the time you're actually sat across someone on a date, you have a much better starting point, I think, and perhaps more confidence about where it can be headed. So no sweeping statement there, but just something to take seriously and think about. Now, however you find someone, one of the biggest questions that we get is, who should I date? Like, what are the specific criteria that I should have on my spreadsheet, on my Google Doc, And based on my experience, I would say I really went through a journey on this. And, one way I put it is to reject the Christian test, in the sense that I think a lot of times people have some list of, 20 characteristics, maybe more, that they're looking for. And, that someone happens to be a Christian is like number 14 or something, It's just like one of the 20 characteristics that's significant. And then almost kind of like, is this person saved? Are they a Christian? Are they a believer? Yes. Okay, we can check that box. Now we move on to kind of the other elements. And I remember a specific conversation that I had. It was a group of us in a car, a couple guys, couple girls in college. We actually headed down to a missions trip, so a Christian group. And somehow the topic of dating came up, and I turned to one of the young women, a couple years older, and I said, well, what do you look for in a guy? And, I kind of like mentally had my notepad out, and I was like, this is great. She's going to give me like 20 things. I'm going to take all my notes. I'm getting like the inside scoop here. And she looked me like dead in the eye, and she said, an awesome heart for God. Like, full stop, period, right? Like, the way she said it was, and I kind of like waited for a bit, like, okay, all right, cool, cool that that's number one, but what about the other 19, points? And that was all she was saying. And it really had an impact on me. And I found over time that I kind of started with all these things in my head, and that list just got narrower and narrower, but also deeper and deeper. And, at the end of the day, really what I was longing for, if it was in God's will, was somebody who loved him deeply, who loved his church deeply, and who might even love me deeply. There's so much else, that's just pales in comparison to those three things. And so I would look in that way, an awesome heart for God. And maybe one other way to say it is just someone who is fully surrendered to God. Not just someone for whom you could check off that box and say, yeah, they're a Christian, but are they fully surrendered to God? Nothing off limits to him. You need that surrender in marriage because you do not know what's coming. You have no idea what's coming in your life. You have no idea what God might ask of you. Just read through the Bible and see the things that he asked of people unexpectedly. You have no idea what he might ask of you, and you do not want to wind up caught between the will of God and the will of your spouse, because those two things are not aligned if he or she is not fully surrendered to God. So make sure that the first thing that you look for is someone who is fully surrendered to God, and in your heart, if God asks us to do something, then this person's going to joyfully, even if it's painful, say, yes, that is what we will do.
Yeah, I'm so glad your list of 20 criteria got whittled down to 3, because I'm pretty sure the other 17, I was not coming up strong.
No way. No, not a chance.
It's like, if you wanted an athlete, that wasn't going to be me. Anyway, but what Vince has just said about having an awesome heart for God is just so relevant to this question of whether Christians should date non-Christians. And people get really stuck on this. It's not that there's some kind of arbitrary rule here. I think you can hear that, and sometimes people hear that as so judgmental, like you're saying, well, no one else is good enough. But it's not about that. It's not about saying some people are better than other people. It's not about who we shouldn't be looking to date. It's about who we should be looking to date. Because if Jesus has his rightful place in our lives, if we think the whole purpose of life is to get to know God and to fall more deeply in love with him, if he is the lens through which everything about us and where we're headed makes sense, then it's actually only natural that we're going to need to be able to share Jesus with whoever it is that we're dating.
Yes.
It's super uncomfortable if one person thinks that there are 2 people in your relationship and then it turns out there are actually 3. I mean, that's an awkward conversation. If you sign up for just the 2 of you, that's going to come as a bit of a shock. But, at the heart of a Christian relationship, God is there. In a very real sense, Christ is at the center of a marriage between a Christian man and a Christian woman. And, so if the goal of intimacy within your marriage is actually to be helping each other, to be constantly moving closer to God, if one person in the relationship doesn't even want God in that marriage, in that relationship, it's just not going to work. You're aiming in different directions. If Jesus is how you define your life, if he's central to your life in that way, then it doesn't make sense to be with someone who's going on a different trajectory. I can remember there was a point in my life when I was dating somebody who didn't really want Jesus at the center of their life in the way that I did. And I can remember at the time someone prayed for me, and they just shared how as they were praying, what came to mind was like a picture of a 3-legged race, like on a field sports day or whatever. I don't know what you call that in America, but like a school sports day when you're tied together to someone else and you're in a race and you have to run together. But their point was like, not only in this relationship are you running at a different stride, but actually if you're tied together with somebody who doesn't love Jesus, when that's what you're trying to do, you're actually running in opposite directions. It's like they were going left, I was going right, and you're pulling opposite ways. You're just going to land in a heap. You're not going anywhere. There's a sense in which if you don't understand Jesus, you can't understand me. My life isn't going to make sense to you. And so, of course, I actually need to date or marry someone who's able to understand me.
Right. Yeah. And related to that point, I want to fulfill my wife's every desire. I do. But the only way that I can fulfill your every desire, Joe, is if your every desire is Jesus. Like that's the only way I've got a shot. If you feel that every one of your desires can be fulfilled in Jesus, then I can continually point you to him.
Right.
If I'm trying to fulfill those desires myself, then I can't fulfill that desire of my own to fulfill your desires because I don't have a chance. But if you are someone who's surrendered to Christ and truly believe that he is everything, then I can just continually point you to him.
Yeah, that's good. And speaking about our desires, you can't really talk about dating, can you, without saying something about physical attraction?
We're going to go there?
We're going there.
Okay.
How does that desire play into things? Because we're embodied beings, right? So it's always going to have a part to play. It's always going to be important to us as human beings. But I just want to be really clear here. I think physical attraction is important, but I think it should primarily be the result of relationship rather than the basis for relationship. And I've always loved the fact that when you read the book of Genesis and talk about the creation of the world, and we're repeatedly told God saw that it was good at the end of every day. God saw that it was good. But one thing I love about the Hebrew there is that same word in Hebrew, tov, it actually also has a secondary meaning, which means beautiful. The sense being that, it's not just good, but good and beautiful, that these two things hold together. And I think that's really significant because I think that's how we should think about physical attraction and beauty as well, that actually goodness and beauty kind of belong together. That I think it's a very Western notion to sort of, or a modern idea to really see them as distinct, or to think you can be like physically beautiful or attractive without being good in some way.
Right.
And I think our language, we do serious disservice to people when we use the words like hot, like when you call somebody hot, because you're not making any comment on their character. The comment on appearance, that is completely disconnected from who they actually are. And that's what makes it objectification. I wrote a PhD on, beauty in the Old Testament. And it used to drive me mad when people come and ask me the question, well, who's the hottest woman in the Bible then? Never ask me that question. Just like, because it's just it's just not a category that the Bible talks about people in.
Right.
There's not a single woman in the Old Testament who's called ugly, or in the New Testament. It's not language that is used to describe the way that people look. It's just not a category that women are being, examined through in that sense. And so, I just think there's something about that good and that beauty, and even the way language comes together in the Hebrew there, that is so rich because one illuminates the other. I would say, like, my attraction to Vince, it is very physical, but it's illuminated by, who he is. We joked earlier that 15 years in, like, everything goes downhill. But, that beauty of attraction, because it starts from the heart, actually, it means that I can find him more attractive as the years go by every year because I know who he is. Mm-hmm. And so I see who he is shining through all of it, right? Like the little things that, would mean nothing else to anybody but me. But to me, they mean so much. Like I love the random freckles on his shoulder, or, the way he talks with his hands, or the way when he laughs, his nose really crinkles. Those are infinitely precious. It totally crinkles. But those things they're infinitely precious to me because they're his, right? And and in them, I see who he is shining through, the way that he moves through the world with strength and conviction. I see his joy and his kindness, and so yes, it's physical, but it's not on the basis of some random, like, worldly standard of what is hot and what is not, but on the fact that those are the physics of him.
Yeah, and thank God for that, because apparently your nose and your ears don't stop growing, so you've got that to look forward to. So okay, let's push a little deeper into this. If you're single and open to marriage, here I think is a really hard question worth wrestling with. It was really actually significant for me in a season to wrestle through this question. Are there people who you wouldn't date because they aren't good looking enough? And be honest with yourself with the instinctive answer of your heart, because for most people, the answer to that question is yes. And that is true inside or outside of the church. But as far as I can tell, and if you disagree, at the end, you can write into us and we'd love to hear it and be challenged. But I just don't think that that's a Christian answer. I don't think that is a biblical answer. Like, it really seems to me like that is us being enslaved to the world standards and us showing favoritism, which the Bible speaks against, so strongly. And, it bothers me when, all the good-looking people wind up with all the good-looking people, like in terms of what our culture says is good-looking. And the people who aren't as good-looking tend to wind up with the people who aren't as, good-looking. And we find it so odd. Joe said it before, like, oh, there's a 7. Why'd they wind up with a 10? We find it so odd if that happens. And that seems to me so fickle, God is not constrained by our random cultural perceptions of what counts as good looking and what doesn't. I mean, sometimes that like complete opposites from one region of the globe to another region of the globe, whether being bigger is beautiful or whether being thinner is beautiful. But sadly, this doesn't appear to be any different in the church. We seem to be constrained more by the cultural perceptions of our time and place than by this union of goodness and beauty that we see in the biblical terminology and the biblical vision. And so in my opinion, physical attraction is something that should primarily come after you're attracted to someone's character and faith. There may be that instinctive attraction before, but the primary lasting physical attraction comes on the heels of that. You find yourself attracted to someone's awesome heart for God and for others. And then all of a sudden, you really like the way the person walks. You find her posture appealing, her smile, her voice becomes attractive, her mannerisms, all of these things. And again, as Joe has said, don't get me wrong, this is a very physical attraction. I'm not being a Platonist here and saying the physical isn't important, just look on the inside, it's all spiritual. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying that it is imperative for our physical attraction to be a godly physical attraction, one that actually can increase over time. And that's going to be a challenge as we get older if we don't have this right. So what if your wife or husband were to get severely disfigured? Would you just resign yourself to being less attracted to them? No. Here's a crazy thought. What if they just got older, right? Like, no, we're not going to just resign ourselves to being less attracted to a person. But the way that we have found physical attraction has worked in the context of our marriage is as we have gotten to know each other's character, each other's faith, the more deeply we have, the more those things have become symbolized in the physical aspects of what we see in each other. The smile, the crinkled nose, Joe's ears. I got to say something about her now because she said about me. Joe's ears that wiggle when she smiles, right? Like I love that, right? And there's something even about her character that gets symbolized in the way she physically operates in the world. And that's an attraction that can be lasting no matter how many years we're together.
Yes, my ears will always wiggle.
Yes.
But I think we need to be really serious about this and really honest about the struggles here, because our whole lives we have been conditioned to see the world and to see people a certain way. And we're constantly being fed, imaging everywhere saying there is a standard of beauty and that we need to measure up against it ourselves and we need to measure everyone else against it as well. And it becomes addictive, doesn't it? I mean, it leads to not only the way that we see the people around us, but it leads into pornography. And it leads into all kind of addictions that we get into about physical attraction and physical appearance. And we need real heart work here and we need real help here, particularly if we want to have healthy relationships with other people. And I think that requires, first and foremost, complete honesty and vulnerability. Like if you are struggling in this area, if you're struggling with pornography or other ways of distorting the place of physical attraction in a faithful relationship, we've really got to face that and we have to bring it before the Lord. But you also need to bring it up in the relationship that you're in, because it so easily becomes a form of unfaithfulness to the person that you're with. And it's really important that, if you're think about marrying somebody, Paul even talks in the New Testament about our bodies belonging to one another, about becoming one flesh in a really deep sense. And so you need to share with somebody what you're doing with your body, because that's going to be their body someday.
Right.
Like they're literally going to own your body. They have a right to know how you're using it and what you're doing with it, whether it's, with your eyes or anything else. And so I just think this is really key for us. We sort of pretend we don't have problems in this area, or we think, well, now I'm dating somebody, like that'll solve my problem, right? Like that'll solve my pornography problem because I can just put that person in the place of this addiction. It doesn't work that way.
Yes.
Like if you can't be faithful outside of a relationship, then how are you going to be faithful in it? Like marriage doesn't fix porn problems. Like only God can fix these things.
That's
like
right.
only He is able to actually deal with these addictions. They may go away for a time if you stick someone else in the place of them, but when you come to struggles in your marriage or a challenging time, you'll just fall right back into it if you haven't actually dealt with the root of it. So all of these things about how we see the world, about how we see other people, what's even been wired into our brains through the things that we've been watching and how that has formed us. Some of this stuff goes really, really deep. And we have to be honest about that because it's increasingly problematic in our culture. It's increasingly easy to access. It's increasingly impacting people's relationships and their marriages. And so I think we really need to have some honest conversations about what the impact is on us and how we get free and what freedom actually looks like and what faithfulness looks like.
Yeah. And just one additional thought on what you've said is, if you're thinking about entering into even just a dating relationship with someone, I actually think you need to, if you're struggling with something like pornography or an addiction of some sort that's related to sexuality, like I think you need to disclose that early.
Yeah.
Because I think a person has a right to know if there's someone who's dating as a Christian, seeing this as something that ultimately would be a pursuit or a hope, of marriage, even in that early stage, I think that they have a right to know as they take those initial steps, because it's not fair to someone to just sort of ease into the relationship. I'm not going to share this for a while. Now, all of a sudden, the emotional attachments are really strong, but all potentially under the assumption that this significant thing is not there. And then by the time someone gets to the point where they're discerning about marriage, all of a sudden you're throwing a big wrench into a situation that already has a lot of emotions and attachments, related to it. So I would just say that person, if it is the right person for marriage, Joe and I confessed things to each other early in our dating relationship, and I think we had more trust from each other, and we earned more credibility, with each other because we shared those things early on and didn't just, hope that, look, if we just are in a relationship for a year and the emotions get intense enough, then kind of the person won't want to step out of it. So now we can share this thing. Do the right thing, share it at the start, trust that God can, if it's right, bring forgiveness out of confession and move forward in that way. The other thing I would say is just to say, we all need to take this seriously, and we are all complicit in the sexual immorality that is absolutely plaguing our society and the church. And so I'm not looking down my nose at anyone. None of us should be doing that. All of us should be asking, how am I complicit in what's taking place, even more so in such a visual time, in a social media time? It's devastating, and we are blind to some of the ways that we contribute. It was just not long ago when I was watching a show on Netflix, and I can't even remember what show it was. And, two people started kissing on the show. And, I wouldn't normally think that was a big deal. And all of a sudden it hit me. Like, these two people are married to other people.
Yeah.
And it smacked me in the face, because I was like, how do I not even think about that?
Right.
Well, I just get drawn into watching something, and here are these people having a pretty passionate, kissing scene, and they're married to other people. And I'm not trying to make some sort of big statement about what's right and what's wrong here. I'm just trying to make a statement about myself, that as a Christian, I don't think it's okay that I have watched innumerable episodes where that takes place, and it hasn't even clocked for me, whoa, that's something to think really seriously about. I am paying money for a subscription in order to receive entertainment by two people who are married to other people kissing each other. Okay, I got to take that to prayer, and maybe I got to make some different decisions about how I spend my money and how I use my time. None of us are apart from this plague that is happening, and we all need to take it really seriously, how we're involved, what our responsibility is moving forward.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good segue into this area and in all areas. It's a good question to always be asking, how am I complicit? And what are the things I need to own up to and to say sorry for? I would just say this in terms of thinking through who do you date? Who do you marry? Maybe for me, this might be the biggest character thing that I would want to look for is, are you with somebody who actually is able to be repentant, I guess would be the way I would put it. We've all heard the phrase, haven't we? Love means never having to say, I'm sorry. I mean, biggest lie ever, right? Just the biggest lie ever.
Terrible.
Just so unhelpful. Jesus said the exact opposite. He said, it's the one who's forgiven much, who loves much. It's when you've been forgiven much that you love much. And so I just think fundamental to who you want to date is somebody who understands themselves at the very core of who they are to be a forgiven person, that being absolutely fundamental to their identity. And I think we can kind of lose sight here because often when you're dating somebody, you're in this kind of season of like rose-tinted glasses, never argue, when there are tensions, you sort of sweep them under the carpet. And then it can be only when you get married that suddenly you start, things start coming up that you didn't expect. You're living with someone in a different way. You're doing relationship in a much more intense way. And suddenly there are areas of conflict in your life that you may not have experienced in your dating relationship. And at that point, it suddenly dawns on you, oh my goodness, it's really important that we know how to do conflict. But often it's the area that we're worst in and the area that we're least practiced in in our relationships. One way to think about it is marriage is a decision about who you want to do conflict with for the rest of your life. Because there are always going to be areas where you're going to see things differently and disagree, and you're going to get things wrong. And sometimes you need to challenge each other. And so who do you want to be in that with? And so many marriages fail, I think, because we just never learn how to do conflict well. There's a friend of ours who shared with us a while back that when she'd asked her mom as a child, what should I look for in the man that I want to marry, that her mom had responded, look for someone with a listener's heart. Look for someone with a listener's heart. I remember thinking like, that is just such good advice for life. Somebody who's actually able to really hear what you have to say, who doesn't just instinctively respond defensively. If you raise something that's hard to hear, their instinct isn't to contradict you or to shut you down or to ignore you or to pass over you, but who really, really listens, and particularly can listen to if you're bringing a challenge or if you're saying something hard or something that might, bring them to conviction. And perhaps one way to think about this in terms of relationships, just one really practical piece of advice that we try to implement in our marriage is to never stop at just saying, I'm sorry. Because I'm sorry, at first it sounds good. Okay, you said you're sorry, that's great. But actually sorry in itself, it doesn't give up control, does it? It's just a statement of how you feel. It doesn't really make you vulnerable. It doesn't really require that you humble yourself before someone else. In fact, sometimes I'm sorry, depending on the tone you say it in, but it could actually be a very defensive thing. Like, oh, I'm sorry. You kind of shut it down before you have to have the conversation or really own it. I said I'm sorry, so you got to let it go. But actually, it doesn't really do the work, does it? So perhaps instead of saying I'm sorry, one thing you can say is just to ask for forgiveness instead, to actually live out the gospel that you both know already. It's only when you've humbled yourself before God and really asked for his forgiveness that you begin to know true relationship and true life. And so bring that same principle, that same gospel into your marriage by regularly humbling yourself before each other, looking each other in the eye, not just saying, I'm sorry, but saying, will you forgive me? And then having to vulnerably wait for a response. It's such a different experience, but it's such a powerful thing to have that at the center of your relationship. And, and then when you hear somebody ask that of you, your spouse ask that, will you forgive me? Just to be reminded of how God responded to you when you asked him that question, and to be reminded of his lavish, unconditional forgiveness that he's given you, and that overflowing love and grace that he has shown you, and then to be able to pour that out on somebody else. It's such a powerful thing. So I would just say, when you're thinking about who to date, one really good question to ask is perhaps, when have I ever seen this person truly repent and ask for forgiveness? If you can't think of an incident where you've actually seen them respond to a challenge or conviction by really owning it and really apologizing, then that actually might be a big red flag. A lot of people, you can point to all sorts of things about their character where they look really great on the surface, or, really humble, or, all sorts of things that look great. But have you seen them say sorry and really mean it and really live into it? And if you haven't, just be really cautious, because that's going to be such a key part of your marriage. So if it's not present in them, it's going to be very challenging. So much of marriage about conforming to the image of Christ is that it becomes a process of iron sharpening iron. Vince used to talk all the time about how marriage shines a spotlight on your sin. It really shows up all the things in your life that you were blind to, that suddenly someone else sees all of it and you see it. And it gets really ugly at times, like, oh, I can't believe it's this bad and this ugly and all of these things I never even saw about myself. But so you need to be able to be with someone who can look at those things and not feel threatened and shut down or live in denial, but actually who's excited by the opportunity to grow, to repent, to become more like Christ, to hear the challenge and doesn't see it as a threat, but actually as a gift.
Right.
As a gift.
Right. Yeah, because I don't care who you're marrying a sinner. Right. And I actually think it's one of the most significant things that we did in our marriage when we, banned "I'm sorry" from the relationship and said, actually, again, not to make a sweeping statement like that, phrase is always wrong, but we just found for ourselves, we could throw around "I'm sorry" as kind of like a statement of how we feel and kind of, you're still retaining control. You just sort of say the words, but to ask instead, to have to ask, we've made a rule. I have to say, when I've wronged you, will you forgive me? And it's like, it's vulnerable. Like, it makes me humble myself. And then I have to wait, in silence for your response. And that means I really need something from you. I really need your forgiveness. So we commend that. We commend that to you if you're in a relationship that may be a blessing to you as well. Let me try to just bring this episode to a close. Part of what we're trying to say is that there's a stark chasm, a vast chasm, a stark divide between a vision for relationships that is worldly and not of God, and then one that is a beautiful gospel vision that Jesus provides for us in the scriptures. I heard this quote yesterday, and it was marriage is like real estate. It's the house you built, and sometimes your tastes change. And I thought, that is so depressing, and how could you ever have any confidence, any trust, any hope in this fickle, broken, changing world? I'm just so on my knees grateful that with God, marriage and all of our relationships are called to be something so much grander than that. One of my favorite stories that always sticks with me is about how one of my best friend's parents first started dating. His mom had just gone through a terrible season of life, and her girlfriend, her friend, suggested going on a road trip together. And so they're road tripping in this convertible, wind blown, no makeup, just divorced, 8 months pregnant, an emotional wreck, okay? And happens to bump into my friend's dad. And right there in that conversation, he asked her to coffee. And that was their first date. And years later, my friend remembers saying to his dad after he, had heard the details of the story, he said, "Dad, Mom must have looked terrible. What were you thinking?" And I think there's a lot of wisdom and beauty in his dad's response. He looked at his son and he said, "Well, I wasn't looking for someone perfect. I was looking for someone I could love." And thank God that he wasn't looking for someone perfect. He was looking for someone he could love, for you and for me, and not because of what he needed from us, but because of what he could give to us. In this Valentine's Day, let us find joy in extending to another the same wonderful grace that we have received. That's all we have time for today. Thanks for being with us on Ask Away. Keep listening to hear how you can send us your questions. We love receiving them. And happy Valentine's Day.
We're so glad you joined us for Ask Away.
If you have a question that needs answering, we'd love to hear it. Send us an email at askawayquestion@gmail.com or call and leave a voicemail at 321-213-9670.
Ask Away is hosted by Vince and Joe Vitale and produced by Studio D Podcast Production.
New episodes come out regularly, so make sure to subscribe.
The best way you can support Ask Away is to leave a review. All you have to do is open up the podcast app on your phone, look for Ask Away, scroll down until you see Write a Review, and tell us what you think.
See you next time. And remember, if you have a question, it's worth asking.